I don't know. It doesn't make any difference. What would you like to hear about?
I'd like to hear your story about being on the farm again.
Well, I was born in North Dakota. My dad had a sheep ranch up there, and I can remember herding the sheep. And I'm trying to figure out sometimes. I had a little pony. We almost needed a pony because I was so small that I was no bigger than the sheep were, so I couldn't do much herding without the pony. But I tried to figure out just how old I was, and I find I couldn't have been any more than 3 or 4 years old.
And you were herding sheep?
When I was herding sheep. And I remember one particular incident stands out so much. I'm riding along, it's a big river way down below there. And of course, all things look different as a child than what they do now. I've been back there since, and I looked, and it didn't look so bad, but to me then it was a long way down there. And I was riding my pony around the end of the sheep, to keep them away from the cliff. And I guess I must have turned her to the right a little bit too fast, and the saddle rolled over. And of course I tumbled out, and there's the cliff over there. I was so scared. I had to get up and take the saddle off and put it back on the horse again. And I remember just being so shaky.
Oh,
wow. That's one little incident that reminds me. Or, of course, another one was where I guess it was Sunday afternoon. The neighbors had come over. Some of the neighbors had come over, and us kids were there, and my cousin, just all of a sudden he says, "I'm going to shoot Charlie. I'm going to shoot Charlie. I'm going to shoot Charlie." And my dad had his shotgun out there, and this is one time he forgot to unload it, and he's way back there, but he shot up towards the house. And of course the bullet sprayed around. My mother had a few shots in her legs, but when she pulled her stockings down, the shell, most of the shells, the BBs, came out. That's a couple of incidents that I remember.
Wow. Those are good stories.
Of course, I can remember one day at school, I rode horseback to school, and here it is again. I can't imagine what age I must have been, 5 years old, I guess. And some guy says, I guess meaningfully trying to take care of me, told me, don't let this guy get your stall in there, 'cause he's trying to do it. Yeah, he told me, just don't let him get your stall. That's for my pony, see?
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine way back then? That's what we rode to school, and even horses with a barn were at the school grounds, because we didn't have cars.
And this was back in South Dakota or North Dakota?
This was in North Dakota.
And then a little later on, you moved to South Dakota,
Yeah.
is that right?
Well, my mother ran off with another guy and
Okay, that's right.
moved down to South Dakota with my dad because he went back to the homestead down there. My dad homesteaded up in North Dakota, but this was the old place down in South Dakota, Salem, South Dakota, and my brother was 5 and I was 7 when we went to live with my dad. 3 bachelors.
And he was farming there too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, up in Dakota, he was a sheep rancher, but
Okay.
down in South Dakota, he was a farmer.
Okay.
Oats and corn mostly, and because corn was the big feed for hogs, and everybody had hogs, and so everybody had to have corn. And
And Vern, you told us that you felt like you didn't want to be a farmer.
I knew I didn't want to be a farmer right from the very beginning almost. And when we got down in South Dakota, I kept growing up and, growing up a little older and started fooling around with electricity. I don't know just why, but electricity was such a new thing. And there were people in town that had electric lights and different things. But that's about all they had was lights. They didn't have all the appliances that they have today. Quite a bit different.
Yeah. So, do you have any stories for us about when you were growing up in South Dakota that you'd like to tell us? Any saddles from?
Well, it's kind of it's something that's just, to me, is just old hand stuff, and so it try to pick up a story is not really too easy. But I remember going to the rural schoolhouse, the country schoolhouse, one teacher, all 8 grades, and we had sometimes, I think we got up to 23 kids going to school. So sometimes all the grades were not covered though, and so she didn't have to split us up that way, but then just the one teacher for everything, and she would come to school so early, and in the fall and winter and spring, she had to come to church and get the old heater going, coal heater, and getting the place all warmed up before us kids got there. I tell you, it just seems so funny. Teachers now don't know what it's like to really be a teacher back then. And sometimes I think about it. Do they know what the difference is?
Yeah, that must have been a hard time to do all that. Now, Vern, you decided not to become a farmer or a rancher, and so what did you do? I think you joined the military, or were you drafted?
No, I had nothing to do with the military or anything. I was just going to grammar school when I started all these things, and of course you had to have a hotshot battery, what they called a hotshot battery, to start the old Model T, unless you could crank it fast enough to get the magneto to work. And so we had to have hotshot to make it easier. And I don't know how many extra batteries my dad had to buy, because I'm fiddling with electricity and finding out things about it and everything. And See, I know it's kind of interesting. It goes through a wire, and it doesn't even have to have a hole through the wire to flow through. That's my first impressions of what electricity was. And so I fooled around with that, wore out a few batteries, I'm sure. And just see what would happen if I touched them together and what I could do. And you know, you get a Model T coil out of the ignition system, and then they buzzed, they vibrated as each spark plug came around. And so we could hook that up and give somebody a nice, pleasant shock once in a while, which was nice. It was fun for the kids who did it, but not much so fun to receive it.
Sounds like kids were always getting in trouble.
Well, we get into trouble once in a while, yeah, but mostly it's just playthings and fun. And of course, with being my interest in electricity, I was right up on top of all of this, finding out things that I'd have to give myself a shock. But a car, if you reach over and touch the spark plug, well, whether it's running or whether it's just starting it when you crank it, and if you reach over and touch that and don't touch the car, anybody else touching the car gets a shock.
I'll have to remember that.
Yeah, well, the car would be, it was a rubber tire, so it wasn't grounded, but you have to make sure it's grounded somewhere. You have to drive a little stake in somewhere, and so you have to prepare to do it. But then you just reach over and touch the spark. Of course you get a shock, but you know what you're going to get, but they don't know about it, and so they jump away from their car because it's hot.
Oh dear, I'll have to remember that one. So Vern, did you go on and become an electrician then as you got older?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
What did you do before that? Did you go to college?
No, I just went. I did get to go to high school.
Oh, good.
I was one of the very few boys, farm boys, that went to high school, because everybody grew up to be on a farm and a farmer, and they didn't need high school because they learned everything from their dad on the farm and everything is necessary. Mm-hmm. And so
you got to go to high school. That's neat.
I went to high school because I did not want to be a farmer. I knew it. Yeah. I just didn't want it to be, so I found out I could go to high school. There was one other guy. Well, he lost his dad, and so he lived on a farm and everything, but it was all rented out. Other people were farming it for them so they could live in the house. And he didn't really know. He was a smart kid, and he didn't really know what he was going to be when he grew up. And so he went to school with us, with me. Him and I drove back and forth 10 miles to Salem every morning, every night. Of course, in the wintertime, sometimes we'd have to rent a little bachelor's quarters in town just for a few days in the wintertime when, well, some of them stayed there a little longer, of course. But we were like, I guess guess about 6 kids living in one room,
Oh, wow.
going to school. This is high school.
Was that fun having all the
I
kids together?
I guess so.
To know 'em pretty
It was
well?
kind of, you didn't think about it. It's the only way you're going to get to go, so you better do it. And so, didn't really think about it.
So Vern, eventually you did join the military after you got out of high school, or was
No.
that later?
No, it was much, much later.
Much later.
We had some kid on the farm that his parents saw that he was getting out of hand. Started stealing chickens. That was a big thing for, kids or even grown-up people in order to get enough to even live off of. So they go stealing the chickens. Like chickens were something that almost everybody at one time or another, well, more than one time or another, during the summer, different places, different times, get the old hens and turn them in, and then as the new chicks came out and started laying eggs and everything. And get myself all tangled up here, and I don't remember
That's okay.
where I was now.
We were telling us about how you ended up getting into the military. So one of your
Oh,
friends
well,
families put your
yeah. He was going, they could see he was getting out of hand, so they sent him to the Navy. Oh boy, they just made him go. And when he came home with that uniform on, oh boy, that's what I want to be. So eventually I did get in the Navy, but it was much, much later. Now, my mother and her new husband and kids moved around throughout the country for quite a while, and they ended up in Medford, Oregon. And so when I finished high school, I was ready to go somewhere. But I was the most timid kid, more scared of my own shadow, practically. Just afraid to get into a crowd or talk to anybody. And you don't get far that way. And so it wasn't too long before when we went west. There's some people, very few of them, would run out to California for the winter because they had some relatives out here somewhere that they could run out here and spend the winters or part of the winters anyhow, instead of putting up with them back in South Dakota.
So cold. So you liked the guy's uniform, and you decided
Yeah,
to
that's what I wanted.
Pretty sharp.
And so, and my mother was out there now, and of course, if I get no place to go, that would be terrible to have no place to go. Oh gosh, I couldn't imagine how some of these people just learned to, ride the rails. They didn't have automobile transportation then, so they'd sneak a ride on the freight trains, because there's always some boxcar that was empty, and the railroad people didn't want them to do that, but they snuck on there and got on different ways. And that wasn't for me. I just wasn't that type of a guy. But so I rode out with 2 other kids, and I rode out with one of these ladies who was going out for the winter. And when we get out here, I had a little money in my pocket, and of course, you don't sleep in hotels or anything. If you sleep any place, it's wherever. I guess we actually slept in her car when we were driving out there. And somehow we put our money together and bought us an old Model T and drove from Washington down to California. And we didn't know what to do with the car down there, so we sold it. And then we just sort of, buses were a heck of a lot of cheaper transportation than what they are now. And so we used bus transportation. And when we came down from Washington with this Model T, we would stop along the way, and if there was any work to be done, we got into picking tomatoes, I believe it was, or something, between the rain showers. So we got one good day in. It was not rainy enough that we could get out there and pick. But the next morning it was all rainy, and so these 2 other guys and I had bought this Model T, and so we were driving on our way down to California, and we stopped along the way and just, pick up jobs like that. And when it was raining, we might as well get on the road and get as far as we can, because one of the kids, or both, just one of the kids had some connection with somebody in California. And I don't really remember spending any time with them. Seems like the other kid did. But I was, one of these scaredy cats. And so I took the bus. We did a little hitchhiking once in a while too. But mostly we somehow had money for a bus. And so I went back up where my mother was in Medford. And I stayed there. I just moved right in there. They had 2 rooms, a kitchen and a living room, but of course you use the living room for bedrooms, or there was a back porch. You could sleep on that when it's not too cold. But of course if it gets cold, then you put on more blankets. And,
a lot of adventures.
So that's where I spent my time, and I got a job working I started out handling apple boxes. Now these great big boxes, about so long, so big around, round, they're square, of course, but that's about the dimensions of them. And I understand they weighed 48 pounds. And handling those all day, not an easy job. But I came off of the farm, so I had enough muscle to be able to handle it.
You were used
Of course, I was the youngest one working there and everything too. But I made it. know,
We're gonna stop right now, Vern, for a minute.
Oh, that's about the.
Is that 30 minutes? Okay.
We can have him spell out his name.
Yeah. He's got lots more stories to tell.
Oh, I
Can we
know.
come back again sometime?
We should. Definitely.
Vern, could you tell us your name and spell it for us, please?
well, I like to be called Vern.
Okay.
My name is Vernon
Vern Johnson.
Johnson. Now, back there, I was a Johansson because my dad's name was Johansson, and somehow when he snuck off to get married, he got married by the name of Johnson. Now, I could have just well as anything have gone and kept the name Johansson all throughout my life, but it wasn't on my birth certificate that way, so it kind of worried, it kind of bothered me. And so I took the name Johnson because that's what he got married by. But back there I was always Johansson until I moved out west. When I started living with my mother, I was just Johnson because that's what my dad got married under. And so that's why the difference, why I changed my name on the way through.
Is Johansson Swedish?
Oh yeah, my dad is from the old country, from Sweden. He came over as a kid, as a young man, I guess. And so
So he's from the old country. That's neat. Okay.
he and his parents, well, he had an uncle was over here already, I guess, or something. He was older than my dad was. And not that he had anything to do with us, because my dad was just a floater. He was born in South Dakota. No, he was born in Sweden, but he lived and brought up and everything was in South Dakota, and that's where he ended up. In the first place is the home place, the home farm. After me, he and our family bouncing around in North Dakota.